Let's start with the constructor, which is similar to Angular or probably also other frameworks. This function is executed firstly when the contract is deployed. All these variables which we see here, they are top level variables. That means we can access them in the constructor and also other functions which we'll have throughout the contract. All the variables will be initialized when we deploy the contract to falsy values. That means my number would be 0, is active false, password will be empty, bytes 32, string would be empty string, and so on, so on. But if you want to initialize them to a different value, then we can do that in the constructor just by typing the name of the variable and give it some value. Let's say we would assign my number 16, is active we would set to true, and name we would set to, let's say, Thomas. So this way we are initializing the values to some different ones. So this is what constructor does. It performs some initialization of our contract, either setting up some variables or maybe even executing some functions which initialize some variables or calculate some initial values. Now let's look at how function signatures looks like in Solidity. So I will write a comment where I will describe how the function signature can look like, and then below we will define some functions. Function signature starts with the keyword function, of course. Then we have the name of the function, and then inside we can write the parameters. So far it looks like in any other function in any programming language. We also specify any type and the name of the parameter. But now this is where it gets interesting. We can also specify how the function is accessible, and we can choose from, I will write it in curly braces, from public or external or internal or private. Let's start with the private. The private function means it can be only accessed from this contract, so we can execute it only in here. So if we would have another function here, then we can execute this name function inside. It's only accessible from here. Internal, on the other hand, would be accessible inside this contract, but it would be also accessible from any derived contracts. External means this function would be accessible only externally, and it would not be possible to execute it inside or call it in from inside this contract. And public means, well, everything anyone can access. All these access modifiers can be also applied to variables, such as we can make this my number public, we can make the is active only internal, and so on. So same apply for the variables. So let's take an example. If we have a function called setName or setNumber, which would take param of type uint256, because that's the new number, and we set this function to be external, and we would assign a new number, so my number would be equal to new number. Then this function would be only accessible from our, let's say, front end, only externally. We would not be able to set the number somewhere down the line with this by calling this function. If though we use public, then we could also call it within our contract. On the other hand, if we would say internal or private, we would not be able to call this function from external sources such as our front end. So I hope it makes sense, but it's kind of self-explanatory, the names. Moreover, the function can have one extra type in signature, which is pure or constant or view payable. So let's talk what does this mean. But before we start to write more functions, let's make sure that we go to Solidity compiler on the left side and click compile our contract, and we can see we already have an error because constructor must be always public. So let's change that. And we can also check the auto compile, so it will automatically get compiled when we write something new. Excuse me, we need to edit in the end of the function, just right here. Yes, constructors needs to be public, because they will be automatically executed. So now anytime we write, we got warnings as well. So we head back here. Pure function means that it's not reading from any environment and that it's not having any side effects. Let's compare it to constant and view. So view, which I would prefer over constant, means that we can have a function which returns, for example, any our variable such as my number. So let's write function which returns my number. We can write function get number. We don't need any parameters for that. We need to specify visibility if we want to execute it, for example, from our front end. then we need to write external or public. And then let's write view. And now the last thing comes in when we are returning values. We need to write returns. And then in parentheses, we need to specify what type is it. So because the my number is uint256, we're going to return 256. And then we can just write return my number. So we can see compiler does not complain. If we would change this to pure, we can see that the compiler complains because it's saying that this expression might read from the environment or state, and that's why it requires view. Pure functions, we can return something which does not read from the state, such as we can return some calculation or we can pass parameter and modify it and then return the result. So it's something which is not reading from the state. If we are reading from the state, then use view, and if you are returning constant, you can use constant. But again, if it is from the state, just use the view. And let's look at the last one. What is payable? Well, payable means that it's a function where you can send the ether. That means when we require some Ethereum to be spent for a function, then we can mark it as payable. That means the user will be asked to send some or the required amount of ether to our function. But now we would not be working with that. And at the end, it's already the one which we have seen, which is the returns. When we want to return something, and then in parentheses, we can specify the parameters which we are returning. So let's summarize functions again, because it was, I think, too much for you in the beginning. But the function starts with the keyword function, then the name, and then if you require, then any parameters in the parentheses. Then there's the visibility. Public, external, internal, and private. Public, accessible by everyone from this contract, outside, all deriving contracts, and so on. External means only externally. So this contract cannot use it, but externally we can execute it, such as making call from the front end. Internal means the function can be used only inside this contract and any derived contracts. Private means this function can be only accessed inside this contract. It cannot be accessed outside, or it cannot be accessed by any derived or inherited contracts. Then we have these modifiers which are pure, which means it's a function not changing any state, not having side effects, and not even reading from the state. It's a function which returns some calculations, and we can understand it that this function does not really depend on this contract. Constant is similar to the view, which means again it's a view function, but in this case we might read some variables from the state and then return them, but all these three are not modifying any state. They are not changing the state, they do not have any side effects, they cannot have. And the payable, which means we can send some ether to the function and then that can be used for something. And in the end we have optionally returns if we have a function which is kind of like a getter and it's returning some values. In functions we can use the basic control flows such as if, else, while, do, but we can also use something special which is called restrictions, which I will show you right now.